My name is Ivelaw Lloyd Griffith. I have the privilege of being a professor of political science and provost and senior vice president for academic affairs at York College, City University of New York. I'm delighted to share with you part of a lecture I gave a few months ago at the Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies in Washington. Center for Hemispheric Studies is part of the National Defense University, and this was a program for senior military and police officials in the Caribbean. The reality of the conversation I had with those senior officials in the Caribbean was a reality framed around two questions. The first question was, if one were to think of United States-Caribbean geopolitical relationships, it's important to ask the question, what are some of the United States' national interests in the Caribbean? As we come to see in a minute, United States, and this is the case of all great powers and even small powers, operate on the basis of what drives what is of importance to their national interests. And so the first question we'll spend some time reacting to is the question of what are some United States national interests in the Caribbean. Then we'll move to the second question, if we have time. The second question being, what are some key security issues facing the Caribbean that make those issues also United States issues because of the United States national interests in the region? It's also important to keep in mind that those two questions and any possible other list of questions should be examined in the context of what is happening contemporarily in the region, what is happening contemporarily in relation to the United States, in relation to United States-Caribbean relations. And I think one of the realities of the broader context had to do with the election of Barack Obama in 2008. The election of Barack Obama was not only a defining moment for the United States, it was also a defining moment for the United States in its relationship with the rest of the world. And part of that defining relationship, that defining character of Obama's election, has even led to a nomenclature, to a talk of our being in an age of Obama. So broad and significant are the electoral outcomes and expectations. And some of those expectations exist in the Caribbean. Some of those expectations that because of Obama's election, the climate of relations between the United States and the Caribbean will improve. But not only the climate of relations will improve, say many people in the Caribbean, the substance of the relationship also is expected to improve. And perhaps one indication of the extent to which people in the Caribbean so embrace Obama's election and have had high expectations set ever since is the reality that in Antigua, their highest mountain, their highest peak, which was popularly called Boggy Peak, was changed officially to be called Mount Obama. It's a symbol, that change happened in August of 2009. It's a symbol of what Antiguans, and I think what represents a broader than Antiguan sentiment of what Antiguans think is the significance of Obama's election for Antigua and for the region as a whole. But I often like to say to individuals and groups, that when one thinks of the United States, either in relation to the Caribbean as a whole, or a specific country in the region, or a specific country in the hemisphere or the rest of the world, notwithstanding the importance of Obama's election as an age-defining event, one should temper one's expectations of what will happen because of Obama's election, because nations, powerful nations, do not operate only in what individual leaders want. They operate in what the national interest dictates what the national interest demands. And I often like to use a very useful sentence by United States' first president, George Washington. George Washington, as you may know, was very fond of writing letters to people in his circle. And he wrote a letter in 1778 to another revolutionary, a guy from South Carolina called Henry Lawrence. And he said in that letter to Henry Lawrence something which I think is a good epigraph in reminding us of the importance of going beyond the individual in looking at Obama or any other president to looking at interests of the nation. And what he said, and I just share one sentence from that letter. It is a maxim founded on the universal experience of mankind that no nation is to be trusted further than it is bound by its interests, and no prudent statesman or politician will venture to depart from it. I think it's reasonable to think that Obama is a prudent statesman. Obama is a prudent politician. I think even if you didn't think so, you have to keep in mind that what Obama does will not be simply what Obama wants, but would have to be in the context of what, in the national interest of the United States, Obama thinks is important to do. And so I want to use that reminder of the importance of keeping the national interest in mind as one thing of what Obama's election in setting the stage for expectations with the Caribbean may be all about. So that brings us to the first question. Keeping in mind the importance of national interests, keeping in mind the relationships between the United States and the Caribbean, the first question becomes, what are some United States national interests in the region? Now, the reality is that sometimes a question begs another question. See, if you ask the question, what is United States national interest in the Caribbean? Within that question lies a question of what you mean by national interest. And I'd like to share what I find to be a very useful working definition of national interest, one by Joseph Nye. Joseph Nye has straddled both the academic world and the policy world. He was a professor for several years at John F. Kennedy School of Government. He worked in the administration of several presidents in the Department of Defense. And he had a very interesting article about a decade ago in Foreign Affairs, July-August 1999 edition of Foreign Affairs. And what he said there is this, and I like to use that as a defining feature for what we mean by national interest. In a democracy, said Joseph Nye, the national interest is simply the set of shared priorities regarding the relations with the rest of the world. It is broader than strategic interests, though they are part of it. It can include values such as human rights and democracy, if the public feels that those values are so important to its identity that they are willing to pay a price to promote them. So I embrace Joseph Nye, but I also think that it's important to go beyond Joseph Nye. And in a book I did a few years ago called Caribbean Security in the Age of Terror, I teased out, I developed a little bit more in the Caribbean context, what I call the interest matrix. And in that interest matrix, and I'll just read what those couple of sentences say in that book, Caribbean Security in the Age of Terror. I view vital interests as protection of the physical, the political, and the cultural identity of the nation. And then there are secondary interests that matter, but those interests are to support the primary interests. In practical terms, vital interests would involve the survival of the nation state as a political legal entity, affecting such things as its territorial integrity and its political interests. Secondary interests might involve trade and foreign assistance, health and education, and human rights. And so as we think of the question, what we mean by national interests, we keep in mind that not all interests are the same in value, in kind. Some, in my view, are vital or primary, and others could be put in a category of secondary or not so vital interests. And so if we were to now begin to address the question directly in relation to United States interest in the Caribbean, I think there are four kinds of interests that come to mind, and I'll just spend a little time on a couple of them. I don't think we'll have time for each of them, for all of them. But before I list them, I think it's important to make a couple of observations. What is true of the United States' interests in the Caribbean is true of the United States' interests in the rest of the world. And I would dare say it's true of all nations' interests over time. And that is that United States' interests in the Caribbean, true as United States' interests in Latin America, have not been static. There's a dynamic element over time to those interests. But the second observation I would make regarding United States interests is the following, that what I'm going to offer as at least four critical, vital, and secondary interests are not being presented in any rank order of importance. So what I offer is the first is not necessarily more important than the third or the second. I'm just going to list four and talk a little bit about perhaps two. And so for me, the four set of interests that resonate with the Caribbean insofar as the United States are concerned are democracy, geopolitics, geonarcotics, and geoeconomics. And I'll spend a little time on at least the first two. When you think of United States relations with many parts of the world, particularly if you think of United States in relation to democracy, you find that sometimes, although democracy has been a significant interest for the United States, it often has competed with other interests, competed to the point where you often find contradictions in what the United States does vis-a-vis one country or what the United States does vis-a-vis a region, because it's not the only interests that the United States has to keep in mind. It has to keep a combination of interests in mind. And take, for example, as we talk about democracy being of importance to the United States, you can find evidence over the last couple of decades where the United States has actually done some undemocratic things vis-a-vis Caribbean countries, because in its relationship in what it defined as vital or secondary interests, there were other interests that competed with democracy. And therefore you could have seen, and actually there is evidence of some contradictions of some undemocratic things. I'll give you a couple of examples. You may know of the reality, I'm sure we all know of the reality of Fidel Castro's rise to power in 1959 in Cuba. Well, before Fidel Castro, there was a guy called Fulgencio Batista, very undemocratic person. But Fulgencio Batista was also a big anti-communist. And insofar as the United States' interest at that time in fighting communism, the United States put a little more priority on anti-communism in Cuba than it put on promoting democracy. And so, notwithstanding all the undemocratic things that Fulgencio Batista did, the United States supported it. You go to another part of the Caribbean, you'll find that for a very long time, the Duvalier regime controlled Haiti. Papa Doc Duvalier, as he is often called, was a very undemocratic individual, but he was also a staunch anti-communist. And so if you take a look at the relationship between the United States and Haiti in the 50s and the 60s, you'll find some very undemocratic support mechanisms being given to Haiti's leadership, partly because there was a tension between how do I support democracy as a national interest and how do I support fighting communism as a national interest. If you go into the Central American region, you'll find Nicaragua with the Somozas as examples of how very often there is a tension between one interest, in this case democracy, and other interests, in this case fighting communism, which leads one to see some contradictions over time on the very important interests of democracy that the United States has found to be important in pursuing in the region. But having said that, I think it's important to recognize that in contemporary times, one of the reasons that the United States places high premium on democracy in the Caribbean is because if you were to take a broad view of the hemisphere, particularly the Anglophone Caribbean is a bastion of democracy in many respects. And in talking about the United States' view of the importance of democracy in the Eastern Caribbean, I think it's also important to keep in mind that democracy, as I'm using it, is not simply elections. Elections are necessary, but elections are not sufficient for democracy. And I find very useful something that President Jimmy Carter said a couple of years ago in giving the inaugural OAS lecture of the Americas. And this is what he said about democracy, which I support. Democracy is much more than elections. It is about accountable governments. It is the end of impunity for the powerful. It is giving judiciaries independence from political pressures so they can dispense justice with impartiality. Democracy, said Jimmy Carter, which I support, is protecting the rights of the minorities. It includes those who did not vote for the majority party. Democracy has to do with protecting the vulnerable. And if you were to fast forward to 2009, what President Barack Obama said in Strasbourg, France, in 2009 April, pretty much approximates what President Carter said, representing a view of the United States that democracy is not simply about elections. Obviously, we should be promoting democracy everywhere we can, said Barack Obama. But democracy in a well-functioning society promotes liberty and equality and fraternity. It also means, he said, that you're not going to be shaken down by police because the police aren't getting properly paid. It also means that if you want to start a business, you don't have to pay a bribe. So there are links to corruption and the absence of corruption. There are links to judiciary and economic efficient management of judiciary. There are things beyond elections that are important in thinking of what democracy entails and in thinking of why the United States finds democracy to be a national interest in relation to its Caribbean dealings. But if you were to go beyond that, I think there are several other reasons why democracy resonates as a national interest with the Caribbean. It resonates because over the last decade or two, there have been several factors that have been affecting the credibility of the democratic process in the region. What are some of those factors, you might ask? Well, as is the case in the United States, we have been finding in many parts of the Caribbean a low or declining voter turnout. People are just not bothering to go and vote in certain places. And you may say, well, what's the big deal? Well, what's the big deal is that if you have an election where the outcome, whatever the outcome, was based on a very minuscule proportion of the electorate going to vote, you may have subsequent problems, as you have had in many parts of the Caribbean, I'll come back to in a minute, where the lack of confidence is an issue, where the issue of legitimacy rises to the surface, where the willingness and the ability of the government to do things with the embrace of the population is called into question. So one has got to be worried when the population doesn't want to go vote, and the population has a kind of a sense of fatalism. It doesn't matter who's in charge, or help is not going to be the way it should be, or practical lives are not going to be the way the lives our lives should be. But there are a couple of other important reasons to keep in mind, I think, why the United States has to be concerned about democracy and democracy dynamics in the Caribbean. Electoral fraud and mismanagement has been the reality of many places in the Caribbean. Thankfully, not very many places, but still places enough to cause concern within the region and within the United States. Cause for concern also in the part of the United States is a link between drugs and elections, where funding of electoral campaigns has been dirty money funding. Cause for concern by the United States, cause for concern in the Caribbean. And so, beyond the existence of the bastion of democracy compared to the rest of the hemisphere, where traditionally people go vote and people were voted out, leave. We had a recent election in Trinidad. Manning was voted out, he left. There was no issue. And so that is a practice which is embraced, it is welcome in the part of the United States, it's welcome in the Caribbean. But if you go beyond democracy to the second reason that the United States is interested in the Caribbean, that the United States has a national interest in the Caribbean, that second interest has to do with geopolitics. And geopolitics has to do with the relationship between resources and power. And in the context of a resource that has elements of power on a commercial and a military basis, oil comes to the top. Now, it is true that within the Caribbean Sea, the islands there within the Caribbean Sea are not significant producers of oil. But if you take the larger Caribbean basin, you'll find that there's a fairly significant oil production in the Caribbean, making it important, both for commercial, corporate, and military purpose. The United States has an interest in the Caribbean. Barbados produces oil, doesn't produce enough for its own consumption. Colombia produces oil. Cuba had a recent find of another field a couple of years ago. There is oil production in Guatemala, in Suriname, in Venezuela. There's significant production in Venezuela. Notwithstanding the relationship between Venezuela and the United States, there is a significant importation of Venezuelan oil. And Trinidad and Tobago also is a significant producer of oil. But I often say to colleagues that when thinking of the geopolitics of oil, it is important not to think of where the oil is produced only, but it's important to keep in mind where, as part of the oil industry, places where there may not be production, but places which are important because of refining. And I often use as a very good indication of the importance of that St. Croix in the Caribbean. May surprise many to know that in St. Croix lies the world's 8th largest refining facility for a country that does not produce oil. Refining capacity of 500,000 barrels per day. I had the pleasure a few years ago in a meeting in St. Croix to spend a few hours having a conducted tour of that facility. And so when you think of American interests in relation to oil, the United States does not think of only where oil is produced. The United States think of how does the production translate into refining, and how does that refining capability enable me to do what I want to do, corporate, commercial, and military. Interesting vignette about the Volvensa facility in St. Croix. That facility is a joint ownership between an American company, the Hess Corporation, and a Venezuelan state corporation, PDVSA. So notwithstanding the political dynamics between the United States and Hugo Chavez and in Venezuela, the commercial relations are there, things are happening on a different front. But again, it's not necessarily a good thing to limit the thinking on the geopolitics of oil just to petroleum, where it's produced and where it's refined. It's important also to ask, are there other geothermal energy products that are important to the United States in a geopolitical sense? The answer is yes. And the one that comes readily to mind is liquefied natural gas. It may surprise you to learn that the small Twin Island Republic of Trinidad and Tobago supplies United States with about 75% of its annual liquefied natural gas interests. And so, not only in relation to oil, but also in relation to liquefied natural gas, the Caribbean is important to the United States. But then, insofar as the geopolitics is concerned, thinking of natural resources, one needs to go beyond petroleum and liquefied natural gas to bauxite. Bauxite and aluminum are produced in the Caribbean basin and are significant to what the United States does commercially. They are significant to what the United States does militarily. There is also an interesting reality that if you were to take the top 12 countries around the world for bauxite and alumina production and reserves, several Caribbean countries are on that significant list. We'll come to some of them in a minute. But in thinking of geopolitics, one cannot leave out the bauxite and aluminum. 2005-2008 figures, for example, from the United States Geological Survey shows that 23% of the bauxite the United States imported came from Jamaica alone. 16% of the alumina the United States imported in 2005-2008 came from Jamaica alone. 12% of the total bauxite for that period came from Guyana. 18% of the total aluminum imports from the United States to the United States also for that period came from Suriname. So it's not simply oil, it's where the oil is refined. It's not simply where the oil is produced and refined, it's where it's what is also important in terms of liquefied natural gas. But it's also important to keep in mind that bauxite is part of that picture.